Well, good afternoon to those who are in the Pacific region. Good evening to those who are joining us from Eastern Standard Time. And hello to all of those in between or beyond those zones. A welcome to our third interface event this week entitled Christian Ministry in Pandemic Times. We're delighted to have you with us, whether you've been tracking with us through the entire interface series this week, or whether you're joining us fresh for this session. Christian ministry in pandemic times. We are at a crucial moment for the interface of theology and science. The pandemic has dramatically increased the levels of polarization and politicization around science. The word science has become a weapon in the culture wars. Scientists are vilified and their findings ignored, while conspiracy theories go viral. Sadly, these dynamics are reaching our churches and are even magnified by faith leaders. Yet, we must be discerning about science. Scientists don't always get it right, and we need far more than science to make good public policy decisions. When should and shouldn't Christians listen to science? How can Christians bring a faithful witness to the public square? How do we address tensions and misinformation in our churches? Used well, science and medicine can be gifts from God to enhance the church's ministry in proclaiming the truth, caring for the sick, loving those with whom we disagree, bringing hope, and discipling the next generation. And with those goals in mind, I'm excited to welcome you to this session and my dialogue with Dr. Deb Harzma. Let me introduce our project, the Regent Interface Project specifically, and myself before introducing today's guest. For those of you who are new to our community, Regent is an international graduate school of Christian studies and an affiliate of the University of British Columbia, based in Vancouver, Canada. Specifically, we are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. My name is David Robinson, and I teach theology and ethics here at Regent. I'm also co-leader of the Regent Interface Project, along with my colleague, Professor Ross Hastings. And our focus this year is on engaging the sciences in ministry education. As a part of that, we're working with scientists at our neighboring universities, UBC, as well as Simon Fraser and Trinity Western, in order to give ministers in training access to forefront science. We want pastors to know that scientists can be allies, and want scientists to know that pastors can be allies. We think that it's possible, in other words, both to follow the science, so to speak, and to follow the Creator. This is an urgent calling in our time when there remains some significant distrust between scientific and faith communities. And this being the case, even though a great number of scientists are in fact people of faith. The Regent Interface Project is supported by a generous grant from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, and particularly its program, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. And we're pleased to partner with them to bring you this session. Now, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Deb Harzma, who will be my interlocutor for this next while. She's the president of BioLogos. Deb Harzma holds a PhD in astrophysics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And previously, she served as professor and chair of the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Calvin University. She is an experienced research scientist with several publications in the Astrophysical Journal and the Astronomical Journal on extragalactic astronomy and cosmology. Currently, Dr. Harzma is president of BioLogos, one of the leading North American organizations to promote a harmony between faith and science. BioLogos, as many of you will know, was founded by Dr. Francis Collins, the current director of the National Institutes of Health in the US, and so on the front lines of the fight against the coronavirus. In her role as president, Dr. Harzma is a frequent speaker on modern science and Christian faith at research universities, churches, and public venues like the National Press Club. She's written a number of pieces on the BioLogos website, as well as in several books. And there's one book that's particularly relevant that she co-wrote with her husband and fellow physicist, Lauren Harzma. It's titled Origins, and it presents the agreements and disagreements among Christians regarding the history of life and the universe. And in doing so, they deal ironically with an issue of perennial disagreement among Christians. So she's well poised to address, and we'll be talking about the areas of disagreement when it comes to the pandemic and responses to it. Dr. Harzma has also co-edited with a pastor an anthology entitled Delight in Creation: Scientists Share Their Work with the Church. Beyond these accomplishments and pursuits, she is also a classically trained pianist and enjoys science fiction. And she lives with her husband, Lauren, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where she's joining us from today. Dr. Harzma and I will be in dialogue for approximately 45 minutes, and the questions that I'll be posing to her and some of my comments come both from my own reflections, but also from my own experience in pastoral ministry before this position, my own doctoral work in the concept of the church and church social ethics, working with the thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But I've also been asking students in my pastoral care class and in our theology and science class for their own questions, and I've integrated some of their thoughts into the dialogue that I'll be running with Deb. That said, we'd also like to hear from you directly, whether you're a Regent student or whether you're joining us from the broader public. So after our 45 minutes of conversation together, we'll have a time where I will moderate some of the questions that you pose to us. So at any time tonight, if you'd like to, this afternoon, if you'd like to pose a question to Dr. Harzma, please put it in the Q&A feature. We won't be using the chat room, but the Q&A feature is the place to type in what you'd like asked, and I'll be happy to convey your questions as we have time. We'll take approximately 20 minutes at the end to take your questions, and at that point, we'll conclude with a few announcements. So let me welcome Dr. Harzma to share the screen here, and let's begin with our conversation. So welcome, Deb.
Good to see you again, David.
Good to be with you. So let's talk, first of all, let's set some broader contextual points. And especially before we talk about statistics and national and global issues, I want to acknowledge the personal dimension of the pandemic. We've all been reminded of the power and immediacy of death, and some of us have been reminded of that at very close range. I think of a powerful essay that was written by LaRhonda Manigault-Bryant on the experience of her family's separation because of pandemic restrictions. She writes this, quote, "My mother is dying a painful death, and it has everything and nothing to do with COVID-19. I can't be near her, touch her, cook for her, kiss her, or tell her all the things that I don't yet know I need to say." Close quote. She recounts how her mother remains alone with a fatal illness, but without medical insurance, an elder care facility, or a hospital, and she can't visit her. This is not an isolated case, however, for, she writes, quote, "Hers is the body of all the Black people at the bottom of the pandemic," close quote. And we spoke about some of these race dynamics earlier in your lunchtime lecture on Christian responses to race and science. For myself, I've had that experience of restricted visits. I had a close family member diagnosed with a terminal illness back in August, and flew to see him during a crisis hospitalization, and wasn't able to visit the hospital, and was there for, a week and unable to visit. And I just had a small taste there of what so many people are feeling in terms of the barriers that are put up here in being able to be with loved ones. But I wonder if you could give us a glimpse into the way that you've seen the pandemic affecting individual lives.
Yeah. There's so much grief and suffering of so many kinds associated with this pandemic. I have two different friends of mine who lost parents to COVID, and yes, were not able to be as near them as they wanted to be in those final days and for funeral services. My aunt passed away of cancer during the pandemic, and I was able to be with the family. We found ways to make the restrictions work, but we couldn't share a meal together. But not as serious as the story that you read. I think another thing that has really troubled me during the pandemic is divisions in families over how to deal with masks. And it's different than not being at somebody's bedside, but it's also very hard of different generations who can't talk to each other about masks, can't get together, couldn't get together over the holidays, or some who wanted to get together and they ended up arguing over this. Grandparents not allowed to see their grandchildren, or wanting to see their grandchildren without taking proper precautions. And that has been its own kind of sadness as well.
Thanks for that. So in terms of, and this gets a bit into your work for Biologos, but you've recently written the article, 5 Reasons Christians Should Get the COVID-19 Vaccine. And later on, we're going to talk about the specific dynamics around this question in Christian communities, as well as how to address reluctance to adopt public health measures. But for now, I'd like to ask, just to set more of the groundwork in terms of the scientific and public health considerations that you'd like people to know. So some of the work that informed that article. What do we need to know about the current state of affairs in terms of vaccination?
Yeah. And I've shared that article in the chat if people want to read it or to share it with others. We tried to get the most essential points out here in an easy to read format with lots of links to resources for more information and more in-depth articles. But the message is that the vaccines are effective. The studies that have been done where half the people got the vaccine and half got a placebo, the ones who got COVID seriously and were in the hospital were virtually all in the placebo group. And the vaccine protected people from that serious illness. The vaccines are safe. Now, the testing of them was accelerated, and so people are right to ask questions about that. But I happen to be in a vaccine trial myself. I volunteered and was chosen, and I saw firsthand the rigor and care that is being taken in these studies. But the big thing they did to speed up was start production of the vaccine long before they knew if it would work, so that they could immediately start distributing it once it was proven to be safe and effective. And they also did things like increase the sample size and other things, but they did not cut corners on the quality of the science. Top Christians in this area, like Francis Collins, gladly got the vaccine right away because they saw that the science was very rigorous in how these were shown to be safe and effective. The disease is real. There are risks to any vaccine and there's risk to any medical treatment, but all the signs point to the risks being much less for the vaccine than for the disease. By now, millions of people have received these vaccines and there's no stories of great adverse effects. So if people have been waiting a little bit, unsure, and wanted to see others get it first, well, now is a great time if you're eligible to go and get the vaccine. And the fastest way to get back to normal, to get back to work, get back to school, get back to family gatherings, and is widespread vaccination. If enough people get vaccinated, we have community immunity, and that protects those who are vulnerable and not able to be vaccinated themselves and could be at great risk for the disease. So there are very important reasons to take vaccination seriously. There's a lot of misinformation going around, and at Biologos, we've gathered information from the best Christian experts we know who are speaking straight up about the science, and we hope that is a resource for anyone in your networks who might be hesitant or skeptical of COVID or the vaccine.
Thanks for that. I'd like to talk in the next two sets of questions about ways that we can try to restore trust between communities. So Biologos talks about a harmony between science and faith, and that's something that Francis Collins has drawn out, and yourself as well. Here at Regent, we've tried to think more constructively as well about the relationship between theology and science. And so my colleague, Professor Ross Hastings, has spoken about the deep mutual relations that theology and science have. He's even used the language of coherence to talk about them. So we're both, in both of our organizations, we're trying to work this way. And I've spoken about this recently, and I'll put this in the chat as well, in describing our project, about trying to find mutual trust and to not talk about these entities, faith and science or theology and science, in abstract terms, but to really work between the social communities that we're dealing with here. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to start first by a few questions in under the heading Restoring Trust in Science, and then I'd like to talk about restoring trust in faith communities. So for my first question, in terms of restoring trust in science, you're in a unique position to speak to this because you've had this career as a research astronomer and a former tenured science professor, and you're now in this public engagement role. So I think you're in a great position to help us understand how it is that scientists communicate and how that's different from the way that some of us trained in other areas communicate, but also how that's different from how scientists are represented sometimes by politicians or by the media. Mm-hmm. So in the face of skepticism about scientists' predictions or guidelines or so on, could you give us some pointers on how to hear scientists well?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And you're right, there is a specific way that scientists are trained to speak. And if you only hear the soundbite or the headline, you might not pick up on all of this. But if you listen just a little bit longer, you'll hear more of these aspects. So one thing is that, sorry, I just want to make sure I hit all of my points here. Yes. So scientists, science naturally develops over time. And the whole process of science is to have a hypothesis, you test it, you might be proven wrong, and it's to be modifying your theories as you go. So it is very common for scientists to change their minds, and scientists who refuse to change their minds in the face of new data are not accepted in the scientific community. That's looked down upon. And so scientists are trained to be very careful in modifying what they say. Unfortunately, in political language, that's called waffling. If you change your point of view, it's like you don't have a commitment or something. But if you can think of it instead as integrity, that the scientists are willing to change their mind in response to data and to be open about that. Excuse me. So early on in the pandemic, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Jerome Adams, they said things, oh, don't wear masks. Well, at that point, it was not known how incredibly well this virus spreads through the air. And the focus was on hand washing, and they wanted to reserve the limited supply of masks for hospitals. But now that keeps coming around in social media. Oh, they thought the masks were wrong and they changed their mind. Well, that's exactly what you do in response to data. So that's one thing to watch out for. Another thing to watch out for is scientists speaking in their area of expertise. Now, there are a lot of scientists who just like to speak out on any topic, and they'll speak out on politics and on theology. And in fact, there's quite a few atheist scientists who will just come out and say, oh, well, science has obviously disproved God. And Christians look at that and go, well, then how can I trust what you're saying? Because that can't be right. Well, those scientists are speaking, they're not speaking about biology or about physics, they're suddenly speaking about religion. That's not their area of expertise. So what you want to look for is, what are they trained to speak in, and take that seriously. Now, another thing to watch for is science alone is not the same as public policy. So the scientists can tell you, here's how the virus spreads. Here, if you take no public health measures, here's how the number of deaths is likely to increase. If you take some public health measures, it's likely to increase this way. But then the choice of which of those public health measures to actually implement, which are worth doing, which are worth the larger costs to our society, that is a bigger question, and Christians should be part of that discussion, but it really goes beyond science. A final point to watch for is consensus. Now, here also, Christians often worry about, oh, the consensus among the scientists, that must just be a bunch of groupthink, they're all biased in the same way. And actually, that's not really how it works, because for that consensus to develop in science, that's a formal sort of endpoint that we get to after scientists of many worldviews consider a topic. They all are gathering data, testing the data, checking each other's results. There's a lot of professional rewards for figuring out where somebody else is wrong and getting it better. And when a consensus develops, it's because there's data that strongly support it, and it's been checked by people of many different backgrounds. So once there's a consensus, it's not 100% right. I talked about this example of eugenics this morning, where actually they got it wrong, but it's way better than one person's theory on YouTube. The conspiracy theories that go around is just some person saying, oh, I think it's this way and I think they're wrong, or I found one expert to say this, but really the group consensus of these experts is much more reliable, and I encourage Christians to take it seriously.
That's helpful, and we'll definitely be returning to conspiracy theories later on. But for now, I'd like to follow on from that by questioning the statements trust science or follow the science. So this follows up from what you're saying here. I think there's some legitimate skepticism about these statements for two reasons. And those could be expressed in our own Regent community, where we're hermeneutically trained, for example. So we know that all data has to be interpreted, and then an ethics has to be developed. So the statement follow the science can seem to some to conceal power dynamics. That would be one concern. The second is that science is not a monolith. So you have this definite article and science in the singular. And it does seem sometimes that the medical sciences are driving this, and you have a kind of meta-narrative as opposed to some of the psychological and social sciences that aren't necessarily given equal weight. Nevertheless, I'm very sympathetic with the statement and think it can probably be deployed well. But how would you encourage us to hear the statement, trust science or follow the science, and perhaps even to use it?
Yeah. Just sharing an article we recently produced at Biologos on this very question, should we trust science? And part of it is the problem of the word trust. I think we use that word for trusting the character of a friend, or trusting God and our belief. And that's rather different than trusting science. So I tried to avoid that word with science for that reason, and instead talk about accepting the findings of science, accepting the abundant evidence, acting on that evidence, taking seriously the recommendations of scientists. And that language might be a little more accurate and a little easier for people to, they're not trusting these scientists with every aspect of everything, but they're trusting what they're saying about the data and its implications. So I think that can help. I follow the science. I might have said this earlier today, but there's an unfortunate dynamic that gets set up where you have scientists saying, here is the scientific evidence, and that implies you should do X. And then you have people on the other side saying, well, I don't like science, I don't like what you're saying, so I think we should do Y. And what I'd really much rather have is both sides agree, oh, here's what the evidence is. Now let's consider both X and Y and the pros and cons and work it out together. When we have a disagreement about what the facts are, then there's no way that good public policy can arise. But if you just push, oh, here's what science says, as if there are no broader implications for things like a grieving family member at a bedside, well, then we've lost something too. And this is a great place that Christians can contribute, because we have that broader perspective naturally. We're used to thinking of our faith in addition to, say, scientific evidence, and we can frame those both together in a more helpful way.
Let's go from that to talk about scientists in particular. And I'd like to acknowledge that scientists, I think in our time, occupy a new position of cultural authority. I mean, thinking historically here. a new position of cultural authority and attendant political power in our societies. So we have a historian, Bruce Hindmarsh here at Regent, who helped contextualize this pandemic in terms of earlier instances of plague and how Christians responded to them. And you could take, for example, in 6th century Rome, a plague which came that killed around 1/3 of the population. And you had a lot of people looking to the Christian bishop there, Saint Gregory the Great, for guidance. And Gregory was involved in a lot of administrative leadership in the city as a whole, as well as developing new standards for pastoral care. And his book on pastoral care is a classic. It's a textbook for our pastoral care class this term. But he, in many ways, people were looking for him to describe the situation, to prescribe behaviors, and perhaps even to interpret the meaning of what was happening, and people beyond the Christian community. Now that role seems to be much more firmly in the hand of scientists. And so at a recent panel at the American Academy of Religion, I heard Dr. Anthony Fauci compared to Reinhold Niebuhr. So the scientist now occupying the place formerly held by the public theologian in America. And so just even within this last century, seeing a significant shift that way. Now, you and Dr. Francis Collins, Biologos founder, I think have done great work to keep to the limits of what science can and cannot say and help us to understand that. But it seems to me that you're also taking the opportunity to speak to larger questions of social and spiritual meaning. So I wonder what guidance you could offer to especially scientists who are listening in and Christian scientists about how to hold this new moment of cultural authority well, a moment that was previously held by bishops and church leaders and so on, and including perhaps any warnings about how not to hold that cultural authority.
Yeah, this is a really interesting way of framing it. Thank you. I think you're right that this is what is happening, that scientists are getting this sort of role of cultural authority. It's not accepted across, wide swaths of America, as we are seeing, and maybe Canada as well. Scientists are not trained to have that role, I think, is a big part of the problem here. Now, Francis Collins, Anthony Fauci are people, well, Francis Collins is a person of deep Christian faith. Anthony Fauci has religious roots as well. And they have immense personal integrity, and that has helped them to frame the moment. But it's not what they're trained to do. My wish would be that prominent faith leaders and politicians would have taken this role of defining the moment for us, for the sacrifices we need to make, why those are important, how to grieve the losses of this, how to balance and weigh these factors. And instead, we've descended into this morass of polarization. So I think for believers in the sciences, yes, it is good to realize that you might receive extra authority on issues that you were never trained in, and to take some time to think about how to use that well. And you might also, just as likely in the church or in conservative circles, have that authority not recognized, even authority you are trained in do definitely have. So it's kind of a strange road that believers in science have to walk in these different worlds.
Thanks for that. Let's go to a series of questions on restoring trust in the churches. And I'll just remind people that as we're discussing, if a comment that Deb makes or a question that I ask stimulates thought for you and makes you want to ask a question as well, you can do that while we're going here. Just put it into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll be happy to work to address those in the final section of our time. But I want to move from a few questions on restoring trust in the sciences to restoring trust in the church. And I'm now using the term trust advisedly. So in my interview with you, that's posted on the Regent College website, you said, quote, "Science can help leaders be more effective in their most fundamental tasks of ministry." close quote. And I was delighted to hear that because, of course, the Regent Interface Project is about engaging the science in ministry education, and this is part of our mandate from the AAAS. So I wonder if before, apart from the issues of 2020 and 2021 that we've talked about and are about to return to, could you expand on this claim and give us perhaps a few examples?
Sure. And I'll share in the chat an article that has more on this as well. I think it is so exciting. There's so much potential for engaging science in the church well. And it's not just simply a fun add-on to ministry. It can really help in many different aspects of ministry. A huge one is discipling young people. Surveys shown, I showed a stat in one of the earlier talks, that half of church-going teenagers feel that the church rejects much of what science has to say about the world. And other studies, show that this kind of perception is a big factor in students walking away from church later. Showing young people that you can engage science well and take it seriously shows them that the gospel is relevant to the world that they live in. And it articulates the gospel for the 21st century. And pastors can do that in a variety of ways. It's not that your sermon becomes a science lesson. It's more something caught than taught explicitly. It's bringing in science examples into preaching, just referring to, hey, there was this recent discovery, or a rover just landed on Mars. Isn't that exciting? I look forward to what we're going to learn about how God created Mars. And things like that show that, hey, this church is relevant to the world that they live in the rest of the week. It's also can be very key for evangelism and outreach. It shows, I spoke at a church a couple of years ago, and they put on their big sign out on the highway that goes past their church, and the busy street, and a talk coming up on astronomy and the multiverse, and they had people just show up like, hey, this is cool, a church is talking about astronomy, I'm curious about that. And especially middle-aged men, a demographic that sometimes churches find hard to attract. So it can be useful for just drawing people in. And also, if your church is anywhere near university, it's very important for showing seekers who might be questioning science, think that the church has rejected science, for giving them a path back in to the church. So those are just a few ways. Just one more example I want to give you. A few years ago, I visited a Black church in Houston, Texas, and I was going to give an evening talk about astronomy and wonders of creation. And I asked, as I often ask before going to a venue, so what kinds of views do you have in your church? What are common views of creation, evolution, things like that? And the pastor, he said, well, in our church, we may not be all very educated, but we all love to learn. And I was like, whoa. And he was right. I got there, and this church, I had some of the most perceptive questions I've ever had when I've given an astronomy talk. They loved to learn. And wouldn't that be a wonderful testimony for all of our churches to say, ours is a church where we love to learn? So.
That is a wonderful testimony. Let's talk about an area where you do get some of that love of learning, but you also get some very hardened positions and some very fierce disagreements, and that is the question of origins. And it's a question that is often associated directly with theology and science dialogue, even though, as you pointed out in a conversation we had, that's not always the case in different communities. Sometimes in communities of color, for example, the question of origins just doesn't loom as large as it does in others. Questions of healthcare access and so on are also very significant. And so I think it's worth acknowledging that. But nevertheless, we do have this legacy in theology and science and religion discourse that origins looms large, and debates over evolution, creation, intelligent design. So on many science issues, you've written this book, Origins, you've tracked these different positions and interpreted them. and have done so ironically, and have done so in a way that helps inform as well as hopefully make for peace and mutual understanding, even as people hold their convictions.
Mhm.
But on many science issues, Christians hold a range of views. What can ministers do to move a church to healthy dialogue about differing views?
Yeah. So, talking about a range of views, I have found over and over to be very effective as a starting point in a church community or a school community, something where there is tension and disagreement on this issue. So many people think, well, everybody around me thinks the same thing I do, right? And our church thinks this, right? And to not understand even what other positions there might be. So first, some education where you put here are a couple of different perspectives on this question, maybe different ways to interpret Genesis or different views of the age of the earth. And people see that their own view is there on the list and they go, oh, okay, I am part of this conversation. And then they see that there's other views on the list and they go, oh, you mean those are on the table as well? Okay. And then as you start talking more, maybe there's some discussion, you start to hear, oh, somebody else thinks that too. And it can be both disarming and actually confusing for people. But getting to a point of confusion is actually better than I'm sure I'm right and I'm mad at anybody who disagrees with me. If you can actually get to, I'm confused about what's right. That's actually a step forward in some cases. Oftentimes, rejection of another view is based on misconceptions. Like when I grew up, evolution was a bad word. It was like saying atheism, and there was just no way that could fit in a Christian context. And it takes a while to just even absorb intellectually the idea that maybe there is a way of understanding that Christianly that's different than the atheist way of understanding it. Now, how do you move a church in this direction? It is not easy. Another church I visited it twice, about 5 years apart. And the first one, they were just launching a project in science and faith. And I gave some opening talks. It was a great conversation. Came back several years later and it had grown. In fact, their adult ed, they had rescheduled it and expanded it, and it had higher attendance than either of their church services. They were attracting a lot of people just to come in for their adult eds. But the hard part that I didn't see in the meantime was working through everybody coming to terms with our church actually has a range of views on origins. They had a series of sermons on it. They had, and then they did that first, I think, and then they had some sessions with the parents of the youth group, and then they did the youth group. So they kind of did a progression that way. But it takes a lot of, I guess, fortitude might be a good word, to hold to that course, because many people will want to say, well, I can't be in a church if there's people here who hold that other view because I think that is heresy, or I think that is utterly foolish and ignorant. But I am convinced that when Christ calls us to unity, it doesn't mean uniformity. We have to learn how to be the church together even when we disagree. And we have to learn how to love each other, even when we think the other person has wrong ideas. Loving people with wrong ideas. It's not easy, but I believe that is what Christ calls us to.
So, picking up on wrong ideas, I wonder what, in your experience, makes Christians especially susceptible to misinformation and conspiracy theories. So, what advice would you give to those whose loved ones have gone this route? I mean, some of us have this experience, and we don't gather for holidays in the same way that we used to, but nevertheless, you have these exchanges, which sometimes in our most intimate settings over the dinner table, now over a Zoom call, you have these realizations that someone has bought into something that you think is deeply misguided. So what advice would you give to those in terms of loved ones, but then also what can ministers do to set up a culture that is less susceptible to conspiracies?
Yeah. As for why Christians seem especially susceptible, there's sociologists are working hard to actually try to figure that out. Apparently, usually conspiracy theories are ripe for people who are disconnected from a social interaction. But in this case, it seems to be much more of in-group thinking, of whether it's social media or other factors that are isolating us into echo chambers. And then the conspiracy theories just grow there, where the only people you're in contact with feel the same as you do. But for many of us, we have relatives who are somehow in a different echo chamber, and then we start to hear parts of that and go, what? And how we respond to that. So I have gathered here some specific things that you can do. Well, one reason they've gone rampant is fear. I mean, we're in a very scary situation with the pandemic, very stressful, and resorting to some of these things gives people some sense of control. There's some psychology to these conspiracy theories, but what can you do? Well, one thing, and I'm going to share 2 articles in the chat here that address these questions and give some of the scientific research that's going on, attempting to understand how this works and what is effective. So one thing that has been shown to change people's minds is if a leader of their group that they trust, who has previously held the view that they currently like, if they come out and say, you know, I was wrong, it's actually this other way, that is effective. So reaching leaders of communities is very important. Going right into a pitched battle with someone who is holding this conspiracy theory does not work. And it's really tempting. You know, you just want to say, like, that's wrong, and here are my sources of why I think it's wrong. And they'll come back all the stronger with, here are my sources, and it doesn't go anywhere. What you can do is, especially in a church community, and this is a longer process, but if you can be fostering a community, earlier I talked about a community where people can hold different views and still be in the church together. Another character trait you can foster is modeling looking deeper, that when you hear something, you don't take it at face value, you do some evaluation like, hey, maybe there's another point of view. Modeling how it's, I really wish we could get rid of this sort of thinking that goes, oh, there's secret information out there, and now I know it, and therefore I'm smarter and not deluded like all those other people. That is rarely the case. So often lies come through that form. And if we can model ways to counter that. So one thing you can do is that's been shown to work, is to just warn people about common misinformation techniques, saying that there's messaging that's going to try and play on your emotions and your fear. You should take a second look at stuff like that. There's going to be ones that just amp up the urgency. You have to act now, act now, act now. Well, maybe take a step back. There, especially confirmation bias, and we are all susceptible to confirmation bias. This is the bias where when you hear something you already agree with, you say, yep, that's true. And when you hear something you disagree with, you say, oh, no, that's wrong. But you're just confirming your own view. And so part of it is fostering a culture where it is good and appropriate to change your mind in response to information, and that you should be wary if the only things you're reading are things that you automatically agree with, you never read another point of view, that's not good. And just 1 or 2 other things here. So rather than going into a pitched battle about it, asking questions. And I know the last thing you really want to hear about is more weird conspiracy theories, but you have to take a step back, ask questions, get them talking past their usual talking points, maybe ask how they feel about it. Why is this important to you? And there's actually a study that has shown that if you ask them more about the details, so, tell them, okay, so how do you think that would actually work? Or what would you like to see done in public policy or whatever? And they start talking about it, and people will quickly realize, oh, this is actually more complex than my usual talking point. I hadn't thought of that before. And they can actually talk themselves into a more moderate position if you ask them how they think their preferred way of going would actually work out. Those are a few ideas. And I hope some of those are helpful, and you can read the articles in the chat for some more of those practical tips.
Thanks for that. In terms of people that may or may not hold these conspiracy theories, there's also a deeply felt faith response that can sometimes be expressed in the following statement. So some Christians are saying, God will protect me from COVID. We shouldn't live in fear. Wearing masks and taking vaccine, those are a sign of lack of faith. And they'll maybe have some biblical proof text as well to support this claim. How can a pastor respond to that sort of attitude?
Yeah, it sounds so Christian, doesn't it? We don't want to live in fear. We want to trust God for God's protection, and we want to have faith. And that is all true. I mean, a way you could talk about it is to think, well, how many times have you prayed for safety while traveling? And uh, and then you've chosen to wear your seatbelt. Is wearing that seatbelt a sign of lack of faith, that you're not trusting God to protect you? No, you actually see that that's a useful way of staying safe. And you can even thank God for the seatbelt as a way of protecting you. We can see these things as God's provision for us, a way in which He's already answered our prayers for safety. And the same way we can pray for good health and at the same time accept medical care as God's provision for our health. And I think it's the same with the vaccines and wearing the masks. These are things we can, so rather than thinking, oh, this is a lack of faith, you can wear a mask or get the vaccine out of gratitude to God for His provision, and also out of love for others, thinking of the consequences to others. And similarly, like with the seatbelt, if you go careening off the road and you hit another car, I mean, when we're safe on the road, we're thinking about others as well. And it's similar for masks and vaccines.
That's helpful. Let's talk. I think sometimes those personal faith statements are conditioned by larger ideologies, and that may or may not be something that the person is cognizant of. But I've found helpful a recent study in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, rather, from social scientists. So this is Samuel Perry, Andrew Whitehead, and Joshua Grubbs. And they make the point that you can't divide out society in terms of secular people being more inclined to follow precautionary behaviors in terms of public health measures, and religious people being less inclined to do that, and even sometimes flagrantly transgressing those public health guidelines. They say there's actually a divide within religious people. So you have, on the one hand, one of the leading predictors for following precautionary behaviors is religion and is faith commitment. And I'll return to that in my next question. But one of the leading predictors for not following public health guidelines is also religion, but it's a very specific type, and it's a type that they've called Christian nationalism. And so they're looking at the US context, and they're talking about a particular belief that they describe as so it's a kind of disregard for scientific expertise, but there's a conception of America as God's chosen and protected people. So there's that aspect of protection in there as well. There's also a personal allegiance often to former US President Donald Trump and his approach to this. But I wonder if you could speak about the kind of question of larger ideology as it tacks on to religious communities. It's not just the kind of faith claims that are happening, but there's a bigger political narrative, it seems, that's also at hand. How can we be
Yes.
discerning about that as pastors?
Oh. There's no one political party that can capture all of God's kingdom. It just cannot be done. Political parties are fallible, and no one party gets it all right. And it's important to be discerning, to see the weaknesses in one's own party, and to not just go wholesale. If we're going to show allegiance and loyalty to anyone as Christians, that is to Jesus Christ. And no human figure should come anywhere near in replacing that. So it's been an interesting mix of sociology and ideological things over the last year that is a part of the mix. And yes, Christian nationalism is a piece of it. White supremacy is a piece of it. I don't want to say that every person who voted for Trump falls into those categories. There's a large number of people who voted him for a variety of reasons. There are people who didn't vote for him but couldn't vote for Biden out of their Christian convictions, and that's valid as well. So I guess when it comes to the public health measures, what I wish people would look at and not see it so much in such political terms, and not even as scientists telling you to do this, but as here's evidence in God's creation about how our bodies work. Scientists have figured out how our bodies work, how this virus works, and they're telling you here's a way that you can protect yourself and those around you. And churches should want to do that just for its own sake, regardless of what government rules are and what politicians are saying.
I'd like to bring up then, as a final question for this section on restoring trust in the churches, so front page stories lately in the Vancouver Sun. So during your virtual visit to Regent yesterday and today on the front page of the Sun, we had the story about challenges and legal challenges to what are seen as disproportionate restrictions on church gatherings. And so here I'm not speaking about the churches that are, flagrantly violating public health orders. I'm talking about churches that feel the pain and the tension of having, for example, AA meetings continuing in their building, which they fully support, but them not being able to gather even a very small group for a worship service, or what's maybe more obviously the case, gyms, low impact fitness classes now allowed, restaurants, shopping malls, those great temples of capitalism, remain relatively free to carry on business. And yet, as one pastor friend was describing to me the other day, I think that the communion, I think that the presence of Jesus in our midst, the Eucharist, is an essential service. I think this is something that the people need to have access to. And so Archbishop Michael Miller, the Catholic Archbishop in Vancouver, I think has spoken eloquently on this. He did so back in November in response to restrictions. And now the news in the Sun, and I'll post the link in the chat for those who are interested, talk about his actually giving a legal objection to the disproportionate restrictions churches face. So I wonder if you could speak to church leaders and church members as well who are trying to come to terms with this and wondering what to do. And I acknowledge here that things look very different in Michigan, where you are, to here in Vancouver, but just inhabiting this space with us for a moment, I'd appreciate your insight on this.
So there are definitely times when our governments do things that are inappropriately hindering our religious freedom, and nobody's going to speak up for that for us. We as religious people need to speak up and fight back on measures that are not allowing the free expression of religion. That's how it's in the US Constitution. I'm not sure about the Canadian Constitution. In my state of Michigan, the restrictions are not explicitly stated for churches at all, but they are stated for any public gathering. Size has to limit to X number of people or X percent of capacity, things like that, and it applies to all the venues, which seems a much more legitimate way of treating churches like any other gathering. For us, yes, gathering is so important, and I desperately miss worshiping with my congregation. We've resumed services, but we hum instead of sing, and there's so few people, and I can't hug my friends, and I don't have that exact view of the Eucharist, but to not be able to share communion together. We do it over Zoom, our church. Everybody has the elements in their home, and then we take the elements at the same time. And the part of the communion service where it looks forward to in the kingdom of God, when we all have the feast together, it just made me realize how much more our earthly experience of communion just pales in comparison to what it will be in the kingdom of God. Sorry, I went far afield from where you were talking about, but those are a few reflections.
That's great. I was able to go to a drive-through communion the other day, which is one of the activities that's permitted, and it was surprisingly meaningful. I was very skeptical of it in advance. I thought it was a very reduced experience, but I was committed to going, and the people that served us prayed for us, and I was deeply moved by it, and partly through missing what it is that we hope to one day do again soon. So thank you for that. I'll go now to our final section. I've got 3 questions in this one, and then we'll turn to the broader Q&A. And I'm glad to see that questions have been coming in already. So I've titled this one, New Normal, New Creation. And I wonder first, I'd like to ask, Christians continue to pray, your kingdom come. It's part of the Lord's Prayer. We pray it now, just like we did before the pandemic hit. What are your hopes for our societies as we come through this pandemic? Specifically, what social changes would you hope to come out of this crisis?
Oh, well, there were 2 big changes I hoped for at the beginning that quickly became apparent would not happen. One was an increased trust in science. My hope was that as scientists raised the alarm and said this disease is going to spread rapidly, that as people saw that it did spread rapidly, that they would be like, oh, scientists actually had the prediction right. Or when scientists predicted, if you follow these public health measures, the number of cases will go down. And that happened. And it did not lead to increased trust in science. My other big hope was that with the common enemy of this virus, that we would have, our polarization would be reduced, that we could be able to come together as a society around fighting this. And instead it is, we are torn further apart. So I still am grieving those things every day. The pandemic has actually made me realize that I have put my trust a little too much in human measures to bring about the things I long for. I've been putting too much trust in, education and good efforts that these will succeed in conquering the sin and evils of our world. And well, we'll get to our ultimate hope in a bit, but I'm looking for the kingdom of God in a longer time frame these days.
I appreciate your candor on that point.
Yeah.
So some use the language of new normal, and that can be helpful for some in adjusting, but for others of us, it feels like we just can't be there, especially if we live with a mental or physical illness, and it seems as though the term normal just doesn't suit any of our days. I wonder what advice you might give on coping with all of this at a personal level, perhaps insights you've gained in struggling through this pandemic as we all are.
Yeah. I saw a cartoon a while back that I think it was in the fall, and it said, getting used to crazy is not the same as a new normal. And yeah, we've kind of all had to adapt to crazy, but every day it hits on us like, hey, this is still awful. It doesn't feel normal. And we know we're going to get back to something closer to what we used to have. So I don't find that phrase very consoling personally either. I think what I've done is lower expectations for myself. Like, it's okay to be a little down and depressed some days because things are bad. And when I see so many different friends, family members suffering the implications of the pandemic, I'm an elder in my church and I see different people who are dealing with mental illnesses of several different sorts and trying to cope with those during the pandemic, multiplied by other factors like illness and job loss. Like it's so heavy. And reducing expectations on myself has helped. And I've actually changed how I pray. I used to think that when I prayed, I had to sort of envision and feel along with the person who was hurting. And I couldn't do that anymore. And I now pray much more, Lord, remember them. You be near them. I can't even think about how bad it is for them in some level, but I'm remembering them before you. And you are the one who has to help them. And I know you care about them. And even picturing God putting his loving arms around them. And that has helped me too in my prayer life for others as well.
It's a very meaningful image, and it's something in pastoral care this term that we're trying to learn and relearn, which is that inability to inhabit what another is experiencing, and just the ability to ask open questions, and to not say I know, because we often don't. And I think that that's wonderful to convey that in prayer as well, and how we pray about them. Let's speak about something you said in last night's keynote. So in your talk, Christ in the Cosmos, which I highly recommend to people, and it'll be available this week, you spoke about the Christian hope of new creation. And now that we've been through discussing a number of social problems, and we're going to discuss a few more in the Q&A, we've talked about racism this afternoon, we've talked about the pandemic just now. Could you speak again about our common faith in the Creator, who has promised both the resurrection of the body and the coming of a new creation as a whole?
Yeah, what I said last night is pondering that ultimate reality has been part of what has given me hope during this pandemic. I mentioned in my talk on race how for Black communities, a sermon by a Black pastor on lamenting that nothing has changed. We are still waiting. And it's going to be that way. I think a lot of the problems, the race problems, are so challenging. They're just going to be we'll fight against them, but it's not a quick solution. These problems of polarization in our culture are so deep-seated, and with the strength of the white supremacy sorts of movements, this is very daunting. And I heard an interview between two Black women. One of them was Austin Channing Brown. Our staff has been reading this book, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness, which has been very helpful. She did this interview, and they got talking about this hope and saying, well, do you have hope? Well, no, I'm not very hopeful. Nothing's going to change. But then they made this distinction. There's optimism, and then there's hope. Optimism is based on circumstances, and where you actually see a trend that change is happening, and you become optimistic that things will get better. But hope that is seen as not hope at all, as it says in Romans 8. Our hope is based on a reality that we do not see yet. And living the Christian life in hope is remembering there will be a new creation. And there is a Creator out there who loves and cares for us, and who has promised to walk along with us through the worst circumstances. And it is our hope in that that gives us the courage each day to take another step, to live and walk as if this is true, and to love one another along the path. And that is where we find the hope and the courage to keep going. And science does not give you that. That comes from faith in Jesus Christ.
Good words. Good words to conclude our dialogue portion and open it up to our broader audience questions. And I'd like to begin with a question from Robert Mann. And Robert asks this: North Americans live in the most highly educated population in history. What does the rise of conspiracy theories within churches and beyond say about the efficacy of the educational system?
Yeah, good to hear from Robert Mann. So true. You know, I mentioned I would put my trust in education. If we can just educate everybody, but you know, look around. We have a lot more education than we used to, and still, I mean, we can talk about ways to improve education. Maybe there should be whole courses in training people to detect conspiracy theories and not be taken in by them. Maybe there should be more courses in critical thinking. We could talk about improving education, but maybe it is also a reminder that our sinful human nature is with us and does not go away, no matter how educated and how sophisticated we get. In fact, we seem to become more able to we get these more powerful tools that can lend power to our sinful nature in ways that we didn't have before. And yeah, sin is still with us. So I would hope for churches and pastor training that pastors as leaders of their community can help set a better tone. Historically, if you think back in European culture for centuries, it was like that was the one educated person who helped shape their community. And so that's a very significant role that ministers can have.
Mm-hmm. This is a related question from Jordan Powell. And Jordan asks this: I have noticed that much of the misinformation I see disseminated seems to convince people by virtue of anecdotes and stories, perhaps suggesting that as people we're more easily convinced by shared experiences than by statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Should we also try to find anecdotes and stories to push back on misinformation? And relatedly, what would be good sources then to find those stories?
This is an excellent point, and it is very true. Somewhere I have an article that makes this very point of the power of stories. There's the stories of people you personally meet, which are very impactful, but simply hearing and reading of a story is also impactful. So if you'll notice, when I talked about the rigor of the vaccine studies, I gave my own experience as a personal example. I gave Francis Collins taking the vaccine. Neither of those things shows, I mean, what convinced me is the data, but those personal experiences matter. A woman in my Bible study, she was an election day, well, a volunteer for the counting of the mail-in ballots in Michigan. And I had a fair amount of confidence in that process. But when she described her experience of watching it happen and how diligent everybody was, how careful they were, and she didn't see and one ethics violation the whole day she was there, that increased my confidence in the process. And so the story worked on me. And so I think those stories are very important. And the voice of the person telling the story matters as well. So on the BioLogos website, we don't just put out articles with no author. We have articles by many authors, and they're all believers, many believing scientists talking from their area of expertise and hearing their experiences and seeing them as people, we hope will help as well. And in my talk on race, I pointed out a few headlines. Kizzy Corbett is this PhD scientist who helped to develop the Moderna vaccine. And as a Black woman, she's tweeting a lot to get the word out on vaccines and speaking in churches. She's a believer.
Great. So one of the skills we try to learn as academics is to condense complex ideas and do so in a very succinct manner. And one of the ways we talk about this is the elevator pitch or the 3-minute thesis or something like that, right? So you have a short elevator ride with someone. What do you say that needs to be said? The next questioner may have that in mind when they say, if you had 3 minutes to talk with a Christian, what would you say to persuade them to take the vaccine? What line of conversation would be most helpful? So I'll put the timer on. No, I won't. But why don't you give us a really succinct version of how you would speak to someone to convince them, assuming a shared Christian faith, to vaccinate?
Okay, so I'll assume a shared Christian faith and assume that they've just said something that, like, well, I don't want to take the vaccine, so I already know that where they're coming from that position. Well, it's kind of the rundown I did earlier. I shared how, and it's the rundown in my article on 5 reasons Christians should take the vaccine. I do think that asking questions is important as part of that, to make it a dialogue and not more than an elevator pitch, to ask, so, how do you feel about the vaccine? Oh, I don't want to take it. Well, what are your concerns? Well, I'm concerned about this. Oh, well, have you heard about this side of it? And kind of make it more of a dialogue. And I think people are much more receptive than if they feel like they're being sold something. So we all are pretty sensitive to what it feels like to have something pitched at us. So I think a dialogue would be the way to go.
Well, Deb, I'll ask you to say if you'd like to say a final word to the Regent community, as this is your last event with us in a few moments. But first, I'd like to just express again my appreciation for you spending time with us and doing so many events back to back. We've had you give our keynote last night on astronomy and Christian faith, and a lunchtime lecture today on racism and science. You joined our theology and science class to talk about questions of personal vocation and debates over origins and how that leaves us personally and institutionally. And then, of course, this I think really consequential conversation that we've had today. So we're really grateful for your time and your candor and your expertise, both as a scientist and as a leading public engager on these questions. I'd also like to pass on the appreciation of my colleague, Dr. Ross Hastings, who says, we're very blessed to have had you with us, Deb. Your insights have been so helpful to our Regent community and the wider community in this critical time in history. May you be replenished for what you have awaiting you in the rest of the week. So we do hope that it's a restful remainder of your week, although I'm sure it'll involve quite a big pickup as well with Biologos responsibilities. But we're so grateful for the time you've spent with us and hope we can have you back again at Regent.
Oh yeah, I so wish I could have been there in person to be part of your embodied community there. But I'm so glad that we could do as much as we did over these 2 days. To worship with you in chapel, to interact with the students this afternoon was just a real privilege. I enjoyed it, and I hope this has been a blessing to you all. And I too look forward to being back in your community sometime in person in a future year.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you for your thoughtful engagement and questions and taking the time that you have. And we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yes.